Everything going?
Yeah, good. How was your Eid? We were just talking about Eid, me and Nadeem.
Yeah, it was fun. Alhamdulillah. It was a nice, like it was the weekend. So I think Eid was Friday, and then we got basically it was like exactly the weekend for the 3 days of Eid. I guess today is the third day. Like lots of parties and barbecues and stuff like that. And the weather's been good, so it's been nice.
That's
How about
good.
you guys?
Yeah, I was just with the in-laws. Other than that, didn't get up to too much. The weather here's not the best either. But what about you, Nadeem?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, same. Yeah, we normally split between Eid al-Fitr with my family and then Eid al-Adha with my wife's family. So we're up in Manchester at the moment. Hence the unusual background. Not my usual background. So I
Yeah,
apologize for
it's nice. It's a
that.
bunch of storage. You're in a
A
room with
bunch of storage.
storage.
I've
It's
been
the
I've
most
been kicked into the
dignified
storage
possible
room.
background. Tanzim, it's winter time where you are, right?
Yeah, it's really cold. I mean, generally Melbourne's pretty cold. So I live in Melbourne now. I moved from Sydney. I don't know if I told you that because you bumped into Saadi in Malaysia.
Yeah.
Yeah, Saadi was sending me videos. So Nadeem's good friends with Saadi too.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm really close with Saadi as well.
I was so happy to meet him. I think because he'd always been such a supportive fan of mine through all the ups and downs of people being upset at me. He was always very supportive. So I was really happy to meet him.
Yeah, alhamdulillah, loyal supporter Saudi. Yeah, he's always posting his stuff. Like, how was that trip by the way? With tell us a bit about that trip in Malaysia, and then you were with
Ummatics conference.
yeah,
It was fun. I mean, it was actually fun because I remember really there was another guy his name is oh my god, forgetting his name, from the UK. We were on the same flight, actually. We were coming from Turkey, and because it was funny because he had the worst seat. He had this like middle seat, and like it was like completely packed. I had like a great seat. It was so comfortable, and he slept the whole way, and I could not sleep a wink. It was an overnight flight, and when I got there, I was like, people said I looked like I was gonna die. Like when I got to the conference, I just went to it was at this Istak, this beautiful Islamic Studies Center, part of International Islamic University in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, called Istak, and it's this beautiful, like, kind of Andalusian inspired building. And I just went to the mosque and just passed out on the floor of the mosque for like 2 hours. But it was an interesting conference. I mean, it was more. I don't know. I think in some ways, like, um, it wasn't surprising. So I think probably what surprises me, and I think has been kind of a product of the Gaza genocide, is like a lot of the things that maybe were more normal for me as a Muslim, in the 1990s or the 2000s. In terms of like the ideas of like Muslim unity, or the ideas of like Muslims having like concern for other Muslims, and wanting to have accountable governments and things like that. Like I feel like after the Arab Spring failure, like a lot of Muslims sort of just stopped talking like that, and it became very cynical and very kind of nationally focused, and almost almost secularized, in the not in the sense of they live in Australia and they like living in Western countries or something, but in the sense that they just didn't think that there was any. They kind of were skeptical about any political element to their life as a Muslim, and I think kind of what's happening in Gaza has really re-energized Muslims, just having like some kind of degree of concern for other Muslims and in other countries, and wanting to have like an idea that being Muslim means like having kind of an idea of like some kind of unity beyond just your own like national existence. So I think that's been really nice. It's part of like the Ummatics project. But so I think that the kind of Gaza has really energized that. And it was nice to see like Malaysians and Indonesians and people like that who were really motivated to try and influence like global events regarding Gaza. And then, yeah, it was an interesting conference. Politics in Southeast Asia are very different from other parts of the Muslim world, especially Malaysia. It's like a really unusual place about, um, kind of like the relationship between nationality and religion, between being Malay and being Muslim, is like very different than any place in other Muslim place in the Muslim world that I know of. I mean, it's really interesting if you look at um, like definitions of what makes someone a Muslim. It's really interesting if you think about this, like what, especially in like former British colonies or kind of places that were part of the British colonial world. Let's say like, South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia. The one of the legacies of British law is it actually kind of matches with Islamic law in this sense that like what makes you a Muslim is if you like say you're a Muslim, right? So if I like decide I want to be Hindu, like I can be Hindu. If I decide I want to be Baha'i, I can be Baha'i. If I decide I want to be Muslim, I can be Muslim. So it's like you just defer to the person's subjective identity about what religion they are, which kind of makes sense, right? I mean, like the idea that people like you get to define what religion you follow, and like you can't. But in Malaysia, it's interesting because it's not written in all of the different Malaysian state laws, but especially one of them I remember, I think it's the Federal Territories Kuala Lumpur law. It says that a Muslim is someone who is perceived as Muslim by other people. So it's really interesting. It's like you're Muslim if other people think you're Muslim. Like it's like you're part of a community and they get to decide when. So I'm not criticizing that because I think I don't. In some ways, it's like a more socially realistic. It's maybe like a recognition of the actual social dynamics, which is that actually people actually don't always have the right to make these choices. I mean, whether or not they should or shouldn't is another issue. But that like in some societies, your your identity is on really important issues is going to be set by the people around you. So that makes me think about like um, I don't know about in cases like let's say in a country like Egypt, if you could change. I mean, certainly people convert to Islam, they would get that changed on their national identity card. Um, but I don't know. I think in other countries as well, like in Egypt, for example, it would be your personal choice, but ultimately it would be like what was written on your national identity card. And then I'm sure if somebody was like Muslim and they tried to leave Islam, there'd be some political issues around that. But someone becoming Muslim obviously wouldn't be a problem. Actually, the other day, now I'm just like babbling on. If you guys want me to not talk anymore, I mean, you.
I mean, I have a question because it actually fits nicely to what we want to discuss in general anyway, like in terms of unity, Ummah, and how that looks like, especially in the modern day and age, or maybe how that looked like in history within the Ummah. But on the point about Malaysia, so correct me if I'm wrong, so from what you're describing, are you saying that because that whole idea of other people kind of determining if you're Muslim is almost like, I get that point of the communal aspect. Like essentially, I think there's an image of how people want to see a Muslim conduct their action as, and therefore maybe in that sense, that's what you're speaking to when it comes to how what it means to be a Muslim in Malaysia. It's kind of like you're demeaning your actions. Maybe it's also built on the sort of culture like Malaysians have because they're very good at akhlaq, mashallah. We see them as very nice, hospitable people. Maybe that's kind of what they're going for. Maybe that's what the law is in place in order to kind of feed into that cultural narrative that they want to portray of how Muslim or Islam should look like. so it from an external basis, they're sort of defining, like others get to define if you're Muslim. Do you find that like problematic in some sense, um, in the sense that okay, they're imagining how Islam should look like, and maybe it's not that, it's the way that it's being imagined. Maybe that is the problem. Like we're imagining Islam to be, that has to look in a certain way, but maybe that image is shaped by our by colonialism. I don't know. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so I think there's an interesting tension because on the one hand, you can think of there being an idea of, that our religion or our identity, sorry, our religious identity in the sense of our faith, if we think of that kind of made of like two things, right? There's our kind of internal faith, there's our iman, there's like our feeling of faith, our feeling of belief, right? And then there's like kind of our external actions that are attached to or come out of that or reflect that belief, right? Um, and the Western kind of Western European first kind of Pauline Christian and then later kind of Enlightenment, post Enlightenment notions of religion are really that that like that's like your religious identity needs to be this reflection of your internal belief, right? So no one can control your internal belief. Your internal belief is your own kind of territory, your own purview, and to be a real, sincere person means that your external comportment reflects your internal belief, which no one can control, right? So no one can control your internal belief. No one should be able to control that. This is kind of a post 18th century, post Rousseau, post like kind of American freedom of religion perspective on post Thomas Jeffersonian idea of like freedom of conscience, right? So you have this freedom of belief. Then when you kind of choose belief inside you, your external comportment reflects that belief, right? And then if you do that, then you're a sincere person. But if you act in a way that is externally is not reflecting your internal belief, that's sort of a hypocritical or insincere comportment. So, but it's interesting because in the Islamic tradition, there of course iman is absolutely important, right? So good deeds don't have any. They're like ashes. They're like dust if they're not grounded in faith. So your deeds have to have the proper intention to have meaning. So we also believe that you have like this internal existence of iman, of faith, and then your actions are built on that faith, right? But at the same time, and this is, I think, both difficult to accept from like someone who comes from a Western background or who grows up in a Western society, but also I think much more commonsensical or kind of reasonable, pragmatic. The inner and outer are not like, it's not unidirectional. Like your existence as a religious person doesn't go from like an inner state to an outer, express an outer state. The two are constantly in like a feedback loop. So, and I remember reading this when I was first Muslim. I remember buying the translation of Al-Ghazali's Deliverance from Error, the Montgomery Watt translation, Munqadh min ad-Dalal. I remember buying it in this bookstore in Istanbul when I first went to like the Middle East.
is it like a blue color? I think I have the same one. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah. I mean, I'm sure you have the same one. I mean, so
yeah, I
it's like
think it's the library at the back. Yeah.
probably, yeah. Actually, I still have it. Yeah, I think this might even be. No, I think I gave my original copy to somebody else, but this is the. I think it's called like the Faith and
Okay.
Practice. Yeah,
That looks
I
like a
think
nice one. Yeah, my one's a bit bland.
Faith and Practice. Yeah, this is it. So, um, and I remember. So then we talked about how doing wudu. We do wudu because our outer state and our inner state are connected, right? Which is that this is very different from the kind of Pauline Western Christian idea where Jesus says allegedly in the New Testament, that I'm not saying that he actually said this, but this is attributed to him, that nothing that enters a man affects him. Like, so, like impure, what is it? Like deep, so we're opposite of purify. It's too early in the morning. Nothing that goes into a man pollutes him, right? So there's no notion that like there's foods that are impure. There's no notion that like there's your external body, the external world has no impact on your internal purity. But actually, what Ghazali is saying is that we believe the exact opposite, right? That your external, the reason we purify the outside of our body is because that helps purify the inside of our body, right? And just like you have to have, excuse my, with the exception of my beloved Hanafi brothers, right? Just like you have to have intention to make wudu, you also the wudu also purifies your intention. So you're in this like feedback, this cycle of inner and outer effect, right? You guys understand everything I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or, I mean,
Yeah,
I'm sure you understand. You're probably also just annoyed about what this guy's talking about. That's what you get when you have a podcast with someone at 6 a.m. or something like that. So the point is, so there's this idea that I think it's interesting because in one sense, like we think we in like kind of a Western mindset would think that there's something hypocritical or insincere about your acting in an outward way if your inward way isn't oriented towards that. But actually acting in an outward way influences your inner orientation, right? So one of the reasons, you do a good deeds is not because you have a motivation. I believe and I want to do good deeds for this reason, so I'm going to do good deeds. You do a good deed because that gives you faith, right? So we know that these things are like in a feedback loop. And I remember the story. I can't remember the exact details of the story because it's been so long. But I remember when I was with one of my teachers in Egypt, and this is probably about 2011. And he was telling me the story that this guy, it was like during the time of Omar, and this guy had, committed a crime. Like I can't remember, killed somebody. I don't know what he'd done. Committed zina. I can't remember what he did, but and he said like, okay, I need to go away for like a couple days to like sort out my affairs, and I'll come back and you can punish me. And the guy does that. I'm probably messing up the story, but the moral is the same. And then the guy comes back, and everyone's like, why did you come back? You're going to be executed now. And he said, I didn't want people to say, قد ذهب خير الناس. Like, I didn't want people to think that like people were rotten now. You know what I mean? Like that. I just didn't want people to think that there's no good in people anymore. So there's like an understanding of you need to act in a certain way so that other people don't lose hope. And I think that's very interesting because, I mean, I've often over the years, maybe I don't want to. Oh, here's this thing I was looking for. Oh, I found a thing on the ground I was looking for. It makes me happy. So that that there's sometimes like I don't want to wake up at 6 a.m. and like do a podcast with Tanzim and Nadeem, right? But like you realize you have a responsibility, or if some young guys ask you to be on their podcast, like you don't want people to say, oh, look, these older Muslim guys, they're all just lazy and they don't want to give any time to young people. So I think that's oftentimes enters my mind of having a responsibility to other people. You have a responsibility to others' faith as well. Like you're not just an atom floating around in the world that doesn't have any connections to people. You're in a community, and you have to you have a responsibility for other people's faith to help them.
It reminds me of
so I think it's interesting because like on the one hand, that kind of goes against the idea that you to be a sincere person, your outward comportment always has to be aligned with and inspired by your inner orientation. At the same time, what we know as Muslims is that your inner orientation is influenced by your outward comportment. And similarly, that other people around you, their faith is influenced by your outward comportment. And so you're part of a community. I think that's much more realistic. Although it is sort of a little bit, I think it sort of militates against some of the, like, as I said, sort of not just individualistic, but kind of sincerity oriented discourse of post-Enlightenment Western civilization.
Well, it reminds me of something Ghazali says in his book on love, longing, and intimacy, Kitab Muhabba wa Shawq wal-Uns Rada, which is, I think, book 36 in his Ihya Ulumuddin. He mentions a story at the very end of the book about this really kind of pious Sufi figure who people start talking very, very, positively about. So he goes and robs some clothes and starts wearing these clothes he's robbed, just so that they will speak bad about him, so that his kind of like his intention doesn't get, as you say, polluted. I think that's an interesting kind of juxtaposition, and I think it's an interesting thing about. And I want to return to an earlier point you mentioned about Islam is kind of, do other people accept you in the community, right? So I guess the question kind of for me is, and we're talking about politics and ummah. What is the role of, in kind of your view, about the ummah and spirituality? How do we juxtapose ourselves against others, and kind of like make sure that we, I guess, reflect or are reflected appropriately or correctly within our community? If that question makes sense.
You mean how, as individuals, how are we perceived in our community, as Muslims, how are we perceived by other people?
I guess, yeah, it's internally in our community. And I guess a question, if I clarify a little bit more in my own head, is what is the responsibility of the ummah for ourselves in doing that amongst each other, if that makes sense?
Can you think of an example, like what kind of situation you're thinking of?
I guess, I mean, I guess, I'm sure you've heard this, right? In South Asian, Pakistani context, let's say Tabligh, right? Our Tablighi brothers in Pakistan. And on the opposite side of that, you have the famous saying in Pakistani Urdu, niyat saaf hai, right? So my intention is pure, right? So they're calling you to pray, and you're saying, I can't pray right now, but I have a pure intention. I intend to pray at some point, and my intention is pure. So it's kind of like, how do the two balance out? How responsible are the Tablighi brothers in bringing someone to pray, and how responsible are they for kind of like actually saying, hold on, is your intention really, is it really pure? If that makes sense.
So when you say that thing, my intention is pure, does that mean, is that like what a guy who's not really gonna pray says?
Yeah,
or someone who's literally like, I'm just washing the dishes right now, I'm going to pray in 5 minutes.
No, there's no. It's a strange one, because I think for the most part we accept that there's no real intention to pray for this person. At the same time, I think the social mores.
I think that it's, it's interesting because like when I have something like, when sometimes like, you'll be around, it's interesting because like, we'll go to like other Muslims' houses, like our friends, community members in the area, and it's like time to pray, and a lot of times like no one ever prays. I mean, in theory, like, we're there for an hour, like they could pray before we're there, they could pray after I don't know, like they could be praying, right? So, but I'm always like, I want to pray, but I don't want to like make a big deal about it, because I don't want people to feel pressured. But then you think to yourself, like, well, why shouldn't they feel pressured? Like, why shouldn't you be amr bil ma'ruf? You're not being mean about it. Like, I'm not going to go and like hit them or something or make them feel bad. But like, I should, what's wrong with me going and saying like, hey, where's the qibla here, or like, is there a place I could pray or something? So I think like it's interesting. I just realized there's an X on a tree written across the street. I wonder if that means they're going to chop down that tree. That'd be unfortunate. I just saw this out my window. But so I think that you on the one hand, like, yes, like if you really are like negatively inclined, like you are not in a condition of faith right now and you don't want to pray, like, in theory it would be kind of pointless for you to pray, but if you do pray, you may actually feel like your faith revived, right? You're through the action of prayer. So I should encourage you to pray, right? But if I do it in like a nasty way, if I do it in like a kind of way where I make you feel guilty, or I'm really uh, kind of making you making you you feel belittled or something, then that would be bad. But I think that the idea that you should encourage people is good, dude. But you should encourage them in a way that's like that acknowledges, So sometimes, you'll say this. I do this with like friends of mine, or I say, come on, let's pray. Like, come on, you'll feel better. You know what I mean? It's okay. It'll take 2 minutes, and you make me feel better. Like you'll be doing Jama'at prayer with me or something. You know what I mean? Like, so I think like, if you're not too serious about it, you don't kind of do some fire and brimstone speech about it. I think it can be helpful.
So I
Or
guess,
just being, or just doing or just like my kids. I don't know if this is a good example or not, but like my kids, like they if I badger them, they'll oftentimes they don't want to pray. They'll make some scene or something, or they
yeah,
refuse. But if I just
yeah,
start to pray, they feel bad and they come up and they join the prayer. Like,
I
they
find that.
just your example can be good.
I find that. So I guess in historically, when we did have a khilafah, way back, um, what would be, I mean, from your point of view, what would be the role of ummah, right, of brotherhood in something like that, in kind of embedding spirituality in a community, and making sure that these things are, on the one hand, you're not making someone feel bad about not doing good, you're encouraging them, whereas actually then having the punitive power as well. So what's kind of
Yeah, I
like,
mean, I think it's interesting. Like, well, first of all, I think that the role of the community, and the leaders of the community, both kind of the political leaders, the institutional leaders, is always to create an environment where people are encouraged. So, I mean, this is very simple, but having the adhan, right? So that one of the reasons you have the adhan is so that people can be called to prayer. And you'll see this debate sometimes. They'll be like, even I think in Saudi these days, there's having debate about this, like whether or not you should have the adhan all the time. It's like, well, why shouldn't you have the adhan? Like, why shouldn't you, like, if you're saying, I'm not, if you're, I mean, I'm not, I don't want to bring, focus on any country in particular, but, we see these debates sometimes. If you're saying you don't want to have the adhan, what you're saying is you don't want to encourage people to pray. You know what I mean? That's basically it in the end. You're saying that's not a priority for the community, which I think is a bad thing to do, right? So you should always have that priority. And if you're like, well, it's waking me up in the morning. You know what? First of all, it's good that it's waking you up. And second of all, if you're annoyed and you want to pray Fajr, then don't be a baby. Like, you can go back to sleep. You know what I mean? Like, what are you? You can't go back to sleep if somebody makes any noise. You're the princess and the pea. Like, you need to have total silence, or you can't get your rest. So, so that one sense is like, the community and its political and communal leadership has a role to encourage prayer and encourage pious conduct. On the other hand, I'm trying to think of other examples that we.
Well, I just want to mention something interesting. Well, nice. I just got back from Pakistan recently myself. Went after Ramadan, and I spent a bit of time in my ancestral village, and they would do salawat about an hour before Fajr to encourage
Yeah.
people to get up and kind of do Tahajjud and start with salawat, and then make it to the masjid as well. So it was it was a very nice way of actually of doing that. I found I liked it anyway.
Yeah. So I think it's a statement of identity and of priorities, and I think it's like it's really important to do. And I mean, there's someone who was talking to me. They were in Indonesia recently, and they were like in some kind of not. It was like a suburb of the capital. There was actually not a lot of people where this guy was, and yet they had the same thing. Like they had salawat before Fajr, and people would. I mean, the imam was there, and like even there'd be like one or two people there just doing dhikr before the prayer in the morning. But he said it was so nice to have that, and you realize like how much there's all these people who give their time and their energy for that. Like, there's a guy who's the imam who does that. He goes to the mosque in the morning. There's like, and those people who go and who were present in the mosque and who were there for others and to inspire others, like the amount of effort it takes for a community to create that background for you or me to have experience of faith. There's like an enormous amount of effort, and it's like, you realize like that there's this huge communal will to like have people live as Muslims, and you realize how valuable that is, and then it really upsets me when I see people kind of or discussing whether or not that's valuable or whether or not they should have this or not or things like that. It's as if that's an easy thing to manifest, as if like this isn't this is just something that you can take for granted and turn off and on when you feel like it. I think that's very it's inappreciative. So I'm really grateful for that, because I mean I'm not like I'm not myself like a big community leader. Like I don't organize khutbahs. I don't organize mosque activities, things like that. Um, but I certainly really appreciate the people who do, and that's something I did not appreciate for a long time. Like as many years as a Muslim, I just didn't really think about this as something serious, and now I really really appreciate it. I mean, I see it as sometimes people come up to me, they're like, "Oh, Professor Brown, oh, we really respect you." Oh, well, I say, no, you guys are, I'm not. I'm like not a important person in the community. You guys, you're the guy who arranges the khutbahs. You the guy who does the Sunday school. You guys are the important people in the community. This is much more important than like some professor who writes books.
Well, we need everything, don't we? Actually, I do want to get into the discussion about community. Tanzim and I were talking about this just before, actually. But I think before we get there, there's another question we had, which was about, I think this is an interesting segue, about Ummah historically and how Islamically they acted. I guess it's a value judgment, but it seems like there was always self-correcting mechanisms, or maybe not, where people were organizing exactly these things, durus, gatherings of salawat, dargas, etc., etc. On the other hand, you have the famous examples of Baghdad at the time of Imam Ahmad, which was as some contemporary scholars described it, a cesspit, effectively. So I guess the question Tanzim and I had was, how Islamic, quote unquote, was that ummah back then, and how did it achieve kind of that self-correcting mechanism?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because like when you read in Islamic history, a lot of times you like, for example, questions of zakat, like it's very infrequent that you have, like, after the kind of early period of the first couple of decades of Islamic rule, Zakat kind of becomes a more personal thing. Like people start just giving zakat personally. There's not like a communal collection of zakat. It's difficult to find out data on this, but I think that's the case. You basically have, as you get into like the Abbasid period, there's sort of just the Umayyad and late Umayyad and Abbasid period. Zakat is not like organized collection anymore in terms of people's charity. There's other taxes that are collected, but not their zakat tax. So a lot of times, people just giving zakat is something that's done on their own. Things like prayer, the daily prayers. Obviously, Islamic civilization is a big space and enormous amount of time. So I don't want to generalize here, but I'd say from what I've read, there's not this like focus on making sure people are doing their 5 prayers, right? Just not possible. Like for. But what's interesting is there does seem to be, not all the time, but fairly regularly, whether it's India in the 1300s or Istanbul in the 1700s or something, which is that for Friday prayers, people kind of really get whipped into shape, and sometimes literally, like uh, people will go around and make sure people are going to Friday prayer, and if you're not there, then you can get punished. Like there's Friday prayer is there's much more like almost state, like police involvement in making sure people are going to prayer on Fridays. So I think that's like it's an interesting balance where you don't really. It's not only is it not kind of logistically possible, but also you get the sense that you also don't want to force people. If you're forcing people to do their 5 daily prayers, then there's something. You're not giving space for their own faith. Like you need to, like that you're talking about the Pakistan, just say my intention is pure. Like you can't constantly be making people pray all the time if they don't really want to pray. Like that's just, it's not, you're not giving them the chance to motivate themselves as a person of faith. You know what I mean? Or you're not giving a chance or for sincerity to exist in people's religious lives. But in terms of Friday prayer, like because this is a communal activity, this is a communal prayer, you are like compelling people to be part of it because the community has a right and obligation to enforce its values on its own members, or at least encourage its values on its own members, right? So if you don't, if you don't go to Friday prayer, if no one's going to Friday prayer, then everyone sees no one's going to Friday prayer and they lose hope. Like that example I gave of that guy, people will think that all the khair of the community has gone, all the goodness in the community is gone. On the other hand, like the 5 daily prayers, you people have any number of reasons for not praying at that exact moment, or maybe they're traveling or something. But it's interesting. Like a lot of times I like when it's Ramadan or something and I'm traveling, I'm definitely like a major rukhsa taker. Like I have friends who like they'll fast. Even my wife, she fasts even when she's traveling. I'm like, no, I'm traveling. I'm not gonna fast. I'm like, this is great. You know what I mean? I get like a little break during Ramadan. So, but then sometimes I'll see people, I don't know, like even during Ramadan, like eating Muslims eating. I'm like, why is that person eating? What's wrong with that person? And I'm like, wait a second, like that's me. Like, why am no one? So then I realized maybe I should be a little bit more subtle. Like, even if I'm in an airport or something, maybe I shouldn't. If it's Ramadan, I shouldn't be like eating very publicly. Yeah, just don't. But then again, maybe people wouldn't know I'm Muslim. It's funny because sometimes I'll see people like in the mall or something, I'll be walking and I see like a Muslim woman with some white guy. I'm like, what? Why is she with that guy? This is not, I'm like kind of disappointed. I'm like, wait a second, that's what I look like with my wife. You know what? So I catch myself being maybe unfairly judgmental, unrealistically judgmental.
I want to ask, since you're talking about in the past, like what I guess, the ruling polity would, how they would enforce Islam, right? in that sense, we know that they are trying to showcase Islam in a certain way to the rest of the society. Essentially, like the example you gave about forcing people to go to Jummah prayer, and I guess we don't have that in this like current day and age, right? We don't have. I mean, I'm not that I'm aware of, but would you say that that ruling in of itself is actually Islam being enforced? Because people will be like, okay, maybe in this time and day, even if we were to implement that ruling or that specific action that I guess a previous khilafah were enforcing, is that kind of Islam being implemented now? Because the issue for us is like, okay, I don't know, we're Muslims in the West, we have to follow secular law, and then I guess many Muslims will feel like, okay, how do we implement Islam in this day and age? And then there is maybe a Muslim country, quote unquote, that might enforce that law in the current day and age. Would you say that that's our role, like trying to bring back these rulings in a certain way in this modern context, or should we kind of take?
Yeah, so if you're in a Muslim, I mean, if you're in a Muslim country, then I think these rules should be. I mean, so it's interesting because this is an interesting question. So, like, let's say you have a Muslim country. Okay, why should a Muslim country force people to go to Jummah prayer on Friday? Right. And I think that on the one, if you say no, then what are we saying? Like, if we say no, are we saying that we don't think that Islam should be part of public life? Or are we saying that we think that people should do things because they sincerely want to do them? I think that the first thing is I don't think that we should be I don't think that Muslim countries should be saying we don't want Islam to be part of public life. I also don't think that I think that if we say we're not going to force people to do things unless they're sincere, I don't think that is actually a real Muslim ethos. As I discussed earlier, like our inner and outer conformance are linked. So we don't go around thinking that people we shouldn't encourage things if they're not sincerely intended, because your intention is affected by your deeds. But the third thing, which I think is a valid concern, which is that we don't know if you get in the business of enforcing this kind of stuff, you cause a lot of logistical burden because of people's exceptions. So somebody's traveling, somebody is not Muslim, right? Somebody is has an exceptional circumstance or something like that, right? Where they have, it's an emergency or something like that, and they're taking their kid to the hospital. So there's like, if you get into the situation where you're suddenly dealing with, why aren't you in the mosque? So I'm traveling. Where's your evidence of this? And you're like, and then it's like, I don't have like my ticket or something, or you don't believe that this is my flight info or something, and then someone's missing their flight because etc. It's like that's the kind of stuff that just gets really messy and people end up resenting. So I think that in some ways part of it is one of the reasons that these stuff maybe shouldn't be or isn't always, and it wasn't always and shouldn't be enforced, just because there's all these exceptions that are legitimate. And when you get some enforcement organization or the state or something involved in that, it just ends up making everybody's life more complicated, where it's just easier to encourage things but not enforce them. And I think
in the advent of technology and AI, hypothetically, let's just say there is like a Muslim. I mean, they're like you have Iran, for example, that. But then I guess where technology, where it's heading towards, especially with the development of AI, like the stuff you said about, finding out if they're traveling, I'm sure in the click of a finger with very high tech technology, you can find out where they've been the last, few years. So I don't know if a kind of Islamic polity would be authoritarian to the point where they can kind of police
Yeah,
people's
that's an
Muslim
interesting
actions
question.
through like technology, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, one thing that was interesting, and I actually did a kind of poll on this on Twitter because I was curious about somebody was making this like obnoxious statement about let me see here. Like they're like, oh, in Muslim countries, non-Muslims all the restaurants are closed during Ramadan. So I did like a poll about where in Muslim countries where actually uh, restaurants are closed. I'm trying to let me see here. So this is interesting. Actually, I'm trying to find it, and I think I actually I'm trying to find this this thread.
I'd be
I can't find
surprised
it.
if
Yeah,
a
but
lot
I
of
couldn't find
restaurants
it.
are closed.
What?
So I'd be surprised if restaurants were closed in a lot of Muslim
Yeah, so
countries. I mean,
I did.
everyone,
I don't know
yeah.
if you guys are how good at you are searching Twitter or something, but you can search this on my Twitter thread or whatever. Or you could find this. I had like I should I think I have it in my computer. Right? One second. Um, Let me find this. One second, guys. Sorry, I don't mean to be like antisocial. Just this is actually really interesting.
Nah, all good. Take your time.
Because I promise it's kind of it's related. Ramadan, Ramadan. No, it's not here.
Just restaurants? I'm searching. Oh,
Yeah, so I looked at Ramadan restaurants. Okay, I can't find it, but
Was it
basically,
recent?
open.
is this a friend resident in Malaysia says not sure of law, but people always eat?
Yeah. That thread.
Oh,
So
okay, yeah,
if you go up, you'll see there's lots of I put like I like added more stuff.
yeah. So I'm looking at it
So
now.
basically, I remember about Pakistan is that I think in Pakistan, yeah, you can
Can you
you
see
can read
it?
this. Well, yeah, I mean that's but the thing about Pakistan was that a lot of the main restaurants were closed, but things like roadside cafes and stuff were open, right? So it's interesting because what you see is that like what's open is the stuff around the infrastructure of travel. So so if you were to go and say, imagine this, you're like, okay, it's Ramadan. We are going to go and make sure all the restaurants are closed. Then what about people who are traveling? Where are they going to get their food? So then you say, okay, well, you know what? If you're a restaurant that is kind of linked with a place of travel, you can be open. That makes more sense. But then you have a problem, which is how do you determine exactly which restaurant's linked to a place of travel, right? So, uh, your the restaurant, the cafe in the airport, the cafe by the train station, but then what about the cafe like one block from the train station? Or what about the fact that somebody might be in like a weird place and need to eat at a certain time? So you get into this like whole world of determining exactly which place is related to travel, and then that's like becomes a kind of a burden on the government, or you end up with like. So I think that in some ways it's almost better to just let these things kind of be worked out socially, where a restaurant that is in a place where people are not traveling is not going to be open during Ramadan because there's no points. Like there's no, like how many people is it worth being open if during the day, if you're wasting all this money paying your employees when no one's coming? No, it's not worth it. Right. So like they almost used to let these things kind of happen organically. So I think that would be, and that's much more, I think what happens in Muslim world during Ramadan is that it's not that there's like specific rules, but it's just that places open and close based on the kind of demands. So if you're in a place where there's lots of tourists, you're going to be open because there's going to be non-Muslims or people who are traveling. If you're in a place that's like a town with not a lot of tourists or something like that, then it's going to be, it's not economically worth it for you to be open. So I think like in some ways you could say that, if a government is not enforcing these rules about restaurants being open in Ramadan, then it's like not making a statement about its Muslim identity. That's not necessarily true. It might just be that it's not logistically worth it because you can't really like create rules or enforcement that actually meets the needs of different parts of the community.
Right.
So I think that I tend to go like with a more kind of organic, like ground up approach, where you could have certain like for example, like it's like rules against alcohol. I mean, definitely, I think you should not be allowed to serve alcohol in restaurants. And someone say, well, what about non-Muslims? I say, okay, well, they can have their own restaurants or certain kind of restaurants. You can have alcohol at, but in general, like you shouldn't be able. And maybe like the government should really be like granting licenses. Like this place can have alcohol, this place cannot have alcohol. But that's like a lot more easier to manage than restaurants being open during Ramadan or something. I mean, it's interesting. Speaking of Malaysia, in Malaysia, like if you're a non-Muslim, you can order beer in a restaurant. And then a Muslim in the table right next to you cannot drink the beer. Like they can't order a beer. It's like it's illegal for the Muslim, but it's legal for the non-Muslim. So Muslims are
the ruling. That's a really interesting point. What's the ruling of if it's a sin if the business owner is Muslim and they're serving alcohol, but they're not serving it to the Muslim? Wouldn't that still be considered?
Yeah, that would be considered. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the law is in Malaysia about that, but in sort of certainly the sin would be, it would be sinful for a Muslim to serve the alcohol. But let's say you're in a Christian restaurant, a Chinese Malaysian restaurant. The Chinese restaurant can serve alcohol to non-Muslims, but not to Muslims. Similarly in Qatar, like you can't, if you're in Qatar and there's like a certain store that sells alcohol, it's like kind of like the duty free type store. Like you can go and it's interesting because if like I always think to myself, I'm like, if I was in that restaurant in Malaysia and I was drinking the beer, what would happen to me? Are you? Because probably no one would think to arrest me but if they found out I was Muslim, then technically it would not be legal, right? So if your name is if you live in Qatar and your name is Ahmed, but you're Christian, like if you're like you're Egyptian Christian who lives in Qatar and your name is Ahmed, when your last name is a Christian last name or something, I don't know, Farghel or something like that, and then you go into they might not at first they might not let you in. They go, "Oh, you can't come in here." But then maybe if you said you're Christian, there's something they would let you in. If I went in, they'd probably let me go in. But if let's say someone is like a really well known, Cat Stevens or something like that, and they all recognize him, or then maybe they wouldn't let him go in, right? So I think like there's a general thing about Muslims can go in here if you present as non-Muslim, you can go in here. As you present as Muslim, you can't go in here. And then when you have these like kind of edge cases or liminal cases between the two, it would have to get adjudicated or in that moment of being permitted to enter or not. But I think like so I can't remember if that was the question or not. But I think.
There's another thing, like if a Muslim man is married to a Christian woman, obviously the Muslim man can't tell the Christian wife to not have alcohol house, if memory serves me correct, like there is some injunction within the deen, where because they're not Muslim, right? So obviously, like you can't, like, what's that relationship between your spouse who might not even be Muslim? And
Yeah, so if you, in
where do you get
theory,
alcohol from? If they're in a Muslim country and the Muslim man's married to a Christian lady, for example, and the Christian lady has
yeah,
alcohol,
so I think I mean, you can't tell them they can't drink. I mean, they can drink if it's part of their religious life. If you can tell them they can't drink, you can say you can't drink in the sense like you can't drink in our house. Uh, that's allowed, but you can't tell them they can't drink in the sense that, I mean, if it's part of their, their communion, doing the communion during uh, religious services, that they have a right to do. But if they can't, if they just want to have like bottle of whiskey in the house, you could say that you can't have this. Because that's not like their religious right. If it's a Christian household, they can have alcohol. But if they're a part of your household, then you don't have to let them have alcohol as long as you're not infringing on their religious rights.
I had another question in regards to touching. We were talking about the sense of an ummah, like what it means to be an ummah. Like you already mentioned about in the past how that might have looked like in history. Because right now, I'd say in this day and age, right, like we have a lot of factions, a lot of groups, essentially, right? Like I'd say in general, like Sufis, Salafis, Islamists, this and that, right? And so people obviously, alhamdulillah, like I think in the past decade or so, or in the past year or 2 years, we've seen Syria, we've seen Bangladesh, we've seen activism around Palestine. So we've seen a lot of things where I guess we have this sense of, okay, the Ummah has to do something. But how would you define what an Ummah is now? Because I think in general, from my end, I see it as just a loose definition of, Muslims just, spiritually connected, right? But there isn't any because obviously, we have Muslims living in America, Australia, like we are talking about Malaysia, talking about Indonesia, like they all have different ways, culturally or otherwise, right? Like when it comes to practicing Islam or how they go about it or how they maybe even perceive it, Islam in their day to day, right? Would that be different to maybe how Ummah was envisioned in history? And how would you see, like, how should it look like? How should an Ummah look like in this day and age when it comes to being more interconnected or mobilizing outside of kind of nation states and, secular laws? Like, how should we um, kind of come together more as a more interconnected ummah as opposed to maybe the being fragmented at times in the way that when it comes to mobilizing for the sake of it could be in this case like Gaza, because in the case of Syria, right, like we've seen a particular group that many Muslims within the quote unquote ummah wouldn't even because we have a perception of what Islam, like many Muslims might have a perception of how Islam should look like, and they may not I don't know, align ideologically with Syrian rebels, but then they've seen Bashar al-Assad be toppled, and now they're like, okay, we can get on board because we're one ummah, but they weren't actually maybe part of that ummah previously when it comes to um, understanding the politics that was happening, or the sort of uh, the fight before Bashar al-Assad got toppled. So I think there's those kind of dynamics that maybe don't get discussed when it comes to quote unquote, like what it means to be an ummah.
Yeah.
Because a Salafi may not side with the Sufi in this case, but then politically, like you have the Taliban's another example. I guess we can discuss, like many won't agree with them, but then they are happy that the US government is out of there essentially because of what they've done, but then not necessarily agree, but then we're sort of meant to be one ummah. So I don't know if that question made sense, but
No,
there's that.
I think
What's your idea of like, yeah, like how an
so
ummah should look like?
I remembered something I wanted to say because you asked a really, really good question earlier, which I forgot to answer, which is that, if you have the ability technologically to know exactly, like, is this person traveling or not? I don't think that it should be enforced. Why? Because uh, there's a principle in like hudud law and stuff, and this goes back to a report. I think it's in Sunan of Abu Dawood where uh, the the prophet says, if you go seeking for people's Uyub, their Abe, you will like ruin the community, right? So if you go and you actually seek out people's misbehavior, you will ruin the community, right? So that the reason why, and there's a story in I think Sunan of Abdulrazak Sanani with Omar when he's the caliph, and he's going, and there's like he goes by this house in Medina, and there's like a party. You could hear like over the wall, there's like a huge like Diddy party happening in there. There's like alcohol, everything going. He kind of breaks into the house. He sees what's happening, and he's like basically has everyone arrested. And the guy who's the head of the house is like, you broke like several Quranic commands here. You're supposed to not enter a house through the doorway, not go over the wall. 2, you're supposed to seek permission to enter before you go into a house. And 3, I can't remember the third example, the third Quranic rule he breaks. And then Omar's like, you know what, you're right. And he just says, okay, like I'm leaving. He basically just leaves, takes all the police out, and doesn't arrest anybody, right? So there's a notion that there's a private life that the government does not want to get into. I know this guy's committing a sin in his household, but I don't go in, because if I were to become aware of everybody's sins and make those sins known, I would destroy other people's faith in the community. Right? So there's this notion that you don't want to. I mean, just another example of this. If we go around, if everybody knew everything Nadeem and Tanzim and Jonathan are thinking all the time, we'd be monsters. I mean, if everybody was aware of all the horrible things that go through the heads of other people, we would believe we were living in a world of total psychos, right? But we're not held accountable for our thoughts. We're held accountable for our deeds, because our thoughts are oftentimes we're wrestling with our thoughts constantly. We're wrestling with our feelings constantly. They're not who we are. So I think similarly, like a community it wrestles with its bad impulses. It wrestles with its private conduct, but who it is public face. You know what I mean? And I think that's really important. So in some ways, I think that's like a very, very important principle in Islamic public law, which is that this notion of satr, which you cover up faults, not because you're protecting people who are abusive or who are oppressing other people. That's not the case. But you don't, people's private sins or private misconduct, as long as they're not hurting other people, depriving other people of their rights, should not be made known, because otherwise you kind of discourage and you cause hopelessness amongst the population. People should be able to think the best of their fellow citizens and not always be reminded that people have their own private lapses. So that was, I think, a really interesting question that you asked. So I think that even if you had the logistical capacity to accurately know whether this person's traveling or not, and I don't think that you should enforce these things because of that principle I just mentioned. Then the other question about Ummah, and it's really tough to know, because on the one hand, people have, like for example, what's happening in Syria or what happened in Syria, like you could look at, you hear like the Syrian government comes out with something where they say that they're gonna. I think that like the Syrian president just said this a few days ago, like, we in Israel have common enemies or something, or like, we want to work with the Israelis on this, or they just made a bunch of gestures of goodwill to the Israeli government and stuff like that, which is disgusting. I mean, I don't think any Muslim government should be like cooperating with the Israeli government. But on the other hand, like if you're the Syrian, if you're the Syrian government and your economy and society is like, in a condition of total desperation, and you're just trying to get sanctions lifted, and, you're going to do like, A, B, or C kind of symbolic gesture to as part of the effort to get the sanctions list lifted. Like, I'm not Syrian. I mean, not in the sense of like some national identity, but in the sense like, I don't live there. Like my family's not there, so I might sort of not like a decision, but at the same time, we have to recognize that people who are in those situations like have one, more awareness, and two, like this is a three-dimensional daily issue for them. This isn't something that's like a kind of issue of identity or pride or something that they can think about sometimes. So I think that you have to have a mixture of both kind of commitment and expectation. So, I have a commitment to helping other Muslims, but I also have an expectation that they're going to act as part of a Muslim community more broadly. So I have a commitment to helping Syrians, but at the same time, I expect Syrians to act as Muslims who are part of a greater Muslim community and have an obligation to, I can't sell out, I'm not going to like sell out, let's say, the people of Bangladesh or the people of Pakistan because that benefits me. Like we don't want the sort of just grotesque selling out. On the other hand, there's a lot of territory between those two poles, right? So, uh, a country could engage in some actions in order to pursue their immediate needs. That as long as those actions are not absolutely traitorous or something, you kind of have to grant a level of discretion to those decision makers because they're in a position to know their situation much better than I do. So I don't generally I generally don't talk a lot about on public. I don't talk about like Syria. I don't talk about Afghanistan. I don't talk about even um, what other examples?
That's a really touchy topic, actually, because
Yeah,
that's
I just don't. I just because I don't know enough about the topics. Like I don't, and it's not I have my own feelings about these things, but I recognize that the people involved may have very good intentions. They may agree with me on all the principles, but they may come to a different conclusion about a particular decision because they have more awareness of what's going on than I do, and I just don't have enough knowledge or investment to like second guess them. You know what I mean?
like because people talk about like in the subcontinent context, like China is trying to grow an influence and making ties with Bangladesh in particular, and also Pakistan. But obviously, that's coming at the cost of selling out your Uyghur brothers and sisters, right? But
Yeah.
that is strategic from China's end because they want to grow their influence in that area because of trade. And however, we know like Pakistan, the economic situation is so bad, so they're literally relying on China as like a lifeline, essentially. And similar to with Bangladesh as well, in many ways, economically, especially with everything that's happened, the change of government, like they're probably even going to keep working with China to that extent. And I don't think the Bangladesh consciousness. I mean, I'm not 100% in touch, but I've seen things to suggest that there is that sort of gratitude expressed towards China because of the help and
Yeah,
that.
definitely.
But
I think China is an interesting question because and also here we have to we don't want to be just simplistic, right? So if you say that okay, well, Pakistan is not gonna publicly come out and speak up for the Uyghurs because it has this very close relationship with China and in some ways dependence on China. Okay, true, but let's not be naive, right? I mean, people's the whole like the different levels of international relations are not limited to what a government makes public statements about, right? So, uh, in some ways, I mean, China also engages in these relationships for its own benefit, right? So it does so in part because it wants to show that it's good to Muslims. So the fact of the matter is, China also has internal it also wants to demonstrate to its Muslim population that it is uh, not it is friendly to Muslims, right? So if you uh, let's imagine, like, Pakistan doesn't make any statements publicly criticizing China's treatment of the Uyghurs, but privately, in all these meetings that Pakistani representatives and officials have with Chinese officials, they can say, like, listen, this stuff with the Uyghurs, like, you need to dial it down like 10% or something. If you can, if it can, if it can improve the condition of Uyghurs like 5%, right? Then that's good. Like, because let me tell you this. I don't think that the U.S. government making a scene about Uyghurs in China is not going to improve the condition of Uyghurs in China. I don't think, right? So public statements aren't some guarantee of improvement. But if you have an ally who's asking you privately, hey, listen, like, it would make things a lot easier for us if you would, not do this or not do that specific thing, and then the Chinese government agrees, then actually they have been able to improve the condition of Uyghurs there. So I think that we don't want to just exist on this kind of this level where we only perceive and kind of validate like these public statements. Why hasn't Imran Khan said this, or why hasn't so and so said that? Like, you know what? People are more than just what they say in public, and then sometimes people don't say things in public because they have relationships in private that they can use to improve situations. So I'm not saying we just give people free passes on everything, but let's like be a little bit more sophisticated than just to say that we kind of, why haven't you said anything on this issue? Yeah, I get this all the time. Why haven't you spoken out on this issue? It's like, one, because I don't know anything about this issue. Two, maybe I have my own reasons. Maybe I work on, things in other ways or something. Right? I mean, like, let's not be as I said, like this kind of this obtuse and clumsy about these things. We need to recognize that international relations or relationships and influence are not just about public statements.
Sorry, Nadim, did you want to ask the last question?
Yep.
Yes.
In the last couple of minutes, I think getting to the heart of this whole discussion. So, as Muslims in the West, I think over the years we've heard many kind of positions of who we are, where we are, what we're doing. About we're Muslims like the Muslims in Abyssinia, or Muslims in the Meccan faith, etc., etc., and so on. So I guess the question is, with everything going on now politically across the world, to our Ummah, what is our role, or what should our role? How should we kind of formulate our communities or build our communities in a way that's actually supportive of all these various kind of different politics that are going on across the world?
Yeah, I think that
so it's a big question.
I think that, I think we're in a position where Muslims are in a position where we are politically weak, in the sense not necessarily that we are defenseless, but that we are in a position where we are efforts to have solidarity with one another are strongly criticized and are targeted both militarily and politically and socially and culturally, and we are encouraged to betray one another. We're encouraged to betray our faith. We're encouraged to be cynical. We're encouraged to be materialistic, right? So we need to, educate one another and educate our children to not give in to these like materialistic urges, to not think that, watching makeup videos on TikTok and being like Andrew Tate, influencers or something is the greatest accomplishment. No, that your accomplishment is to kind of stand up for justice, to fight for the rights of other people, right? At the same time, we need to realize that, a lot of times, like if you're going to be targeted, you're going to be made to feel bad for acting publicly as a Muslim. Like that's this is something that's going to be discouraged, and you're going to be face social sanctions for this. But that, you also, like, Muslims are 1.5 or 1.7 billion people. If you can't, nobody can prevent that number of people from expressing their beliefs or their love or concern for one another. And you see this around Palestine now. I mean, the stuff that's happening in America, the kind of stuff that people say publicly about Israel and support for Palestine, like, this was inconceivable a couple of years ago. Inconceivable. I would never in a million years imagine this kind of stuff. But you can't, if enough people are saying something, eventually it becomes normal. It can't be suppressed. So you have to we have to teach our children that if they don't have the courage to speak up on these things, nothing's going to change, and that they have to have enough faith that other people around them will speak up. And that then, look what happened in Bangladesh. It's a very, I'm not an expert on Bangladesh, but if you would ask me, like, do you think this regime is going to get overthrown? I would have said no. I would have been like, what are you talking about? Everything I read is it's like taking over everything. It's ever just getting stronger and stronger. And then suddenly you realize it's not the case. So, if you don't, if people aren't willing to speak up, then the kind of emperor who has no clothes is allowed to continue reigning, for free. Okay, guys, I got to run.
We appreciate your time. Yeah, Bangladesh is good on maybe another time. We like, there's so much to unpack there. Like, a lot of these authoritarian regimes aren't as, like, we can fight back if we sort of mobilize. And I think Bangladesh showed that, and other situations in the Muslim world as well. So appreciate your time, Doc. So I'll wrap it up.
Yeah, we can do it another time. Again, I haven't seen you guys in a long time, so it'll be nice to talk again. I enjoy it.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
This time wasn't as bad as I thought. So, this time, 6 a.m. wasn't that bad. So we can do it again. I'm in a run right now. You want me to leave this stuff on to load or something?
Yeah, if that's all right.
Yeah. Okay. So how long? I'll just leave my computer on, and eventually it'll just go to sleep on its own.